Transformation in Trials. Transformation in Trials is a podcast exploring what we must change in life sciences to get treatment to patients faster. I'm your host, Ivana Rosendal. Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. In this episode, we'll dive deeper into the topic of patient advocacy and clinical trials from a patient advocate's point of view. And in the studio with me, I have Christian John Dillis. Hello, Christian.
Hello, how are you? Thanks for having me.
I am good. In fact, are you right now, geographically?
I live in Brooklyn, New York, and that's where our office is too.
Excellent. Well, I am in Copenhagen today.
Okay.
And it's actually very, very, very warm here. I think Scandinavia is experiencing a bit of a heat wave.
It's been quite hot in New York. The heat is not as terrible as the humidity has been. It's been pretty awful.
As we dive into today's topic, I would be curious to hear more about how did you become a patient advocate?
There's really two primary events in my life. I'm a gay New Yorker. I grew up in New York City. And when I came out at the age of 16 in 1989, it was really the height of the initial AIDS crisis. And, at that point, the federal government was more or less refusing to recognize AIDS, refusing to help the mostly gay men who were acquiring AIDS and dying of AIDS quite rapidly. Though I was quite young, there was obviously a lot of efforts to organize within the community and then take that fight and that advocacy to insist on recognition of the disease, federal funding for the disease, for awareness campaigns, for research into treatments and preventatives, a ton of safer sex education that was going on. And I did quite a bit of that in high school and college. And it was a kind of radicalizing moment, to be 16 and 17 years old and to realize that there was this new deadly infectious disease and, my community was being abandoned by our government. And so then over the years, I was involved in a lot of activism, didn't quite see that through the lens of patient advocacy. I saw it more as like standing up for our community when we were under attack or being left, to this terrible epidemic. But many of those skills remained relevant. And I continued to kind of be an advocate and, not just for HIV, but for, healthcare in general and wanting people to have good outcomes. I spent several years as a fundraiser for NYU Langone Medical Center. That was just sort of part of my DNA by that point. And then in April of 2010, the real incident happened where me and my brother, we lost our mother, Peggy, to a community-acquired C. difficile infection. She was only 56 years old. She had been a single mother for most of our life, so she was like the only parent we had. And, she had us both young, so we were adults and, we assumed that we would have her for a very long time. We went from thinking that she had just maybe the stomach flu because she did teach kindergarten to then thinking, oh, she's dehydrated, we better take her to the hospital. And then within an hour or so of being in the hospital, they told us that our mother was the sickest patient in the hospital, that she was going into septic shock, and they were going to do everything they could, to save her. And we learned in that moment that, she had a condition called toxic megacolon, which is when your colon is inflamed by a bacteria and inflammation, and that it was caused by a bacteria called Clostridioides difficile, which is very difficult to pronounce. People just say C. diff, and that her life was very much in danger. And despite the very best efforts of the doctors at that hospital here in Brooklyn, it was a small local hospital, she died the next day.
Wow.
And it was just emotionally and personally devastating, but it was also devastating in the sense of how could we lose our mother to an infection we'd never heard of? Sorry. That's my dog barking in the background. In the days following her death was, especially like once we'd gone through the sort of funeral and the initial stages of grief, we were like, well, how did this happen?
Yeah.
How did our mom go to the dentist, a couple of days later come down with diarrhea, not connect the two, right? and then end up with this life-threatening infection and die so rapidly. And the more we dug into it, the more we realized that this was a disease that was causing 500,000 infections every year, killing 30,000 people a year just in the US alone. And there was no patient advocacy organization. And even the information, if you looked up online, like it said, this is a disease that affects elderly people, people in nursing homes, people with immune compromised. None of these things were our mother.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a moment where I thought to myself, I just don't want to get out of bed anymore. And I think what got both me and my brother out of bed and back to work was that our mother's death was not going to be in vain.
Yeah.
And that led to us starting the Peggy Lillis Foundation in the summer of 2010.
Yeah. Wow. That is an amazing journey to have gone through, but also just having a disease that is so serious, but that is unheard of, that affects so many people's lives. That is crazy.
At that point, as we were doing research, we found that only 20% of Americans had heard of that disease, had heard of C. diff. And when you think about, the number of people who died from it, it's quite shocking.
I'm going to ask a very basic question. As a patient advocacy organization, what do you do?
We are building a national and now increasingly international C. diff awareness and advocacy movement by educating the public, so raising that baseline awareness so people have heard of the disease, empowering volunteers, so those are mostly people who've either survived the disease or, like us, have lost a loved one to the disease, and also then doing our best to sort of shape policy, and that can be legislative, that could be something like recently the World Health Organization released its list of priority bacterial pathogens, and C. diff was not included. So our organization and organizations in Europe, we are calling on WHO to put C. diff in that category. So it can be a range of different policies that can be state, regulatory, national stuff. And to just give like a little bit more specificity, we run an annual awareness campaign, where we get people featured in the media. We've had people on CBS Evening News. I've been on CNN. We've had both stories in like Self Magazine, Consumer Reports, really trying to reach outside of sort of medicine to get people to, to say like, oh, like my mother's a relatable person, a 56-year-old woman, prime of her life. But then we also have people that, a young woman who had C. diff while she was pregnant, and we have elderly people. And so we're trying to get people to understand this disease. And then in terms of the empowering volunteers, we'd heard a bit about my history, so I was kind of primed to do this work. But oftentimes people want to take action, but they're a hairstylist or they're a HVAC repairman or they're nothing in their training or their life has prepared them to talk to the media, lobby their Congress people. And so we spend a lot of time training them how to do that.
That
so
makes
they
sense.
can be effective.
Yeah. When it comes to the intersection between patient advocacy and life sciences and developing new drugs that can potentially treat, how do you usually interact with life science companies?
We have a few different ways that we interact. I mean, to be completely transparent, we receive a lot of funding and sponsorship from corporations, though we are completely independent of that. Thankfully, the U.S. government is very strict about trying to prevent influence.
Yeah.
But we do work with them, in terms of partnership. And there's a range of different things we do, from them supporting our awareness campaigns financially and also as partners. We also work with them to promote the clinical trials that they're running. And we don't promote like one company's trial over the other. We just generally promote trials for C. diff and recurrent C. diff so that people can learn about them and hopefully participate in them so we get better treatments. Excuse me. Some very direct things that we've done is convening our volunteers to meet with representatives of life science companies who are developing a new treatment. And so even before they start the clinical trial, they're getting input from patients to understand, like, what was it like to have this disease? What do you wish was different? Like if you were in a trial, how did that go for you? So we're noticing that companies are stepping up and trying to have a more patient-centric approach. Another example is that when a new treatment does come up for approval, we don't necessarily advocate for the approval of a specific drug, but we will participate in like the FDA advisory committee, with volunteers who will talk about the impact of the disease to make it tangible to the advisory committee.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. When it comes to patients who have have an infectious disease, it seems to me that like the time you have to decide whether to participate in a clinical trial or not may be rather short. How is it to enroll patients suffering from C. diff in a clinical trial?
I mean, that is actually quite challenging, and it's challenging for a couple of reasons, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing our best to kind of help promote them. Most clinical trials are run out of academic medical centers. Something like 75% of all NIH grants go to academic medical centers, and yet academic medical centers are responsible for only 6% of the healthcare delivery in the U.S. So that means that I live in New York City. There are multiple academic medical centers that I can go to. But if I lived in Ohio, or if I lived in Idaho, or, my options would be far more limited. So I think one thing, especially when you're dealing with an infectious disease, is it's acute. So how do we catch people when they're sick, right? And then how do we ask them to potentially get a placebo, which is a little scary, especially in an infection. And typically those trials are designed so that you're not actually getting a placebo, you're just getting sort of the current standard of care, and then they're giving you the new thing to see if that works better. But even that can be a little frightening. So I think what we need to do is sort of figure out how do we make trials come to people instead of people come to trials. And we've seen some interesting and novel things of having like decentralized trials where people were like, basically the trial will literally come to you. So there's a company we're working with now that is developing a treatment for recurrent C. diff. And if you don't live, I think within 50 or 100 miles of a place where they have a trial, they'll do like telehealth to get you diagnosed, and then they'll send a nurse who will walk you through how to take the treatment. And obviously that's also like a bigger expense for the company, but it also means that they get a more diverse population.
That makes sense. Another thing we briefly discussed when we spoke during the pre-call was this aspect of new drugs being developed for an area where the way to figure out if it's a good idea or not is it superior to the current treatment, or is it inferior? Where there may be some other parameters that are relevant for the actual patient population that might not just be so binary as non-inferiority. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's been a lot of talk about like what are the proper endpoints. I think particularly for, an infectious disease, an acute disease, and then C. diff specifically because it has this nature where like you can have an initial cure and then a couple of weeks to months later the disease comes back. So it's a little novel in that way. And people who have sort of a primary C. diff infection, if the treatment works, it's a little bit more disruptive than maybe having the flu or anything else, but they kind of then go back to their lives and they don't think about it. But if you have recurrent C. diff, and just so people understand, the primary symptom of C. diff is urgent, frequent diarrhea. So it's very difficult to work, leave the house, care for your family, when you need to run to the bathroom every 20 minutes. And, you're afraid to drive, you're afraid to leave the house. So in terms of inferiority to superiority, I think we need to think about it not just from the sort of laboratory, did this drug perform better than the other drug, right? So with C. diff, one of the things they look at is not just that initial cure, but does this drug have lesser chance of there being a recurrence in the future? So that's a different endpoint than just initial cure. But I think we also need to look at things like, especially in the antibiotics and anti-infective space, like what is the mechanism of action? We have increasing antibiotic resistance, antifungal resistance. So it's not just enough that a drug works slightly better. It's like, can this be a bacteria, a pathogen specific drug that we don't use broad spectrum stuff, which is then contributing to those drugs being less effective over time. And I think, other things that really need to be considered is, how well tolerated is it? For most doctors, the first thing they prescribe for C. diff is vancomycin. And vancomycin is a very hard drug to tolerate. It makes people feel very ill. It works. But the other thing is that vancomycin is used for tons of stuff. And so we increasingly see in people, even if they're not sick from it, we find traces of vancomycin-resistant enterococci. So the more we use vancomycin, the more we contribute to people being resistant to it. And because it is such a powerful broad-spectrum drug, if we could move away from vancomycin for C. diff and there's another drug called fidaxomicin that's available now. There are a couple of others in development that really just target C. diff. I think that is important. You know what I'm saying? Even if it only worked just as well as vancomycin, like just have something that is not contributing to antibiotic resistance, but that requires us to look at the societal implications of the drug, right? Not just the patient. And then the cost effectiveness. Is this a drug that's inexpensive to manufacture relative to something else? Is it easy to manufacture? Some drugs require incredibly complex labs and manufacturing facilities, others less so. So to the extent that we can also think about like how likely are patients to be able to access this drug, I think that's another important consideration. I mean, again, all things being equal, we don't want to give people a cheaper, inferior drug. But if it's as effective, if it's maybe even slightly more effective, like there are other considerations that I think should be taken into account. Yeah. So,
that makes a lot of sense. That it's not just about like the specific drug one-on-one. It's like the whole ecosystem that this treatment is happening in. And how can we improve, like, basically the whole ecosystem for the better, be it for that specific patient or be it for the whole community of diseases? Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that we see now is given, international travel and, people crossing borders, which I'm not against. But like even something like the EU, where everyone can travel between, citizens of the EU can travel between all these different countries, it is much easier for a pathogen to escape, a small community and it can travel around the world. We saw this with COVID, right? Yes. So, we need to think globally. And I think, we're seeing troubling signs of things, like lessening of vaccination, both in the US and elsewhere. Yes. So we're seeing diseases that were considered, gone, like measles or smallpox, that we're now seeing a return to. Maybe you don't personally want to be vaccinated against something, but what about the other people? And obviously that's, to some extent a case-by-case basis on how communicable a particular disease is. But, measles is more communicable than the flu or the common cold. So very dangerous.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. This is Ivana Rosendal. To get treatment to patients faster, we must have well-functioning organizations. But how do we do that? Well, I have written a story about people who try to make their organizations more well-functioning. It's called Maneuvering Monday, and it is available on Amazon now. You might just get inspired or at least have a good laugh. Yeah. Now, of course, C. diff, based on your organization's efforts, is more well known. But what about other diseases that are also small and that only a few people have heard of? How do we make sure that they still stay present in the eyes of the sponsors who are developing drugs?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of effort, a lot of different efforts in the US to incentivize the development of new antibiotics, and specifically, but then anti-infectives more generally. So there's been the GAIN Act, which was passed over 13 years ago, that's Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now Act. There's also the LPAD, which is limited population. So when you have something like CRE or VRE, which are terrible, terrible infections that are very, very difficult to treat, but they're also very uncommon. Thankfully, they're not easily spread. But, so it's very hard to get 100 people because you may not even have 100 people in the country in places big as the US that have CRE at the same time. So I think, we need, and, we're in a sort of anti-government moment in the US. So this is not going to be popular among those people. But I think we need to actually think about, a drug development that is guided by science and by societal need rather than by profit or patient demand. And right now, profit and patient demand, and by patient demand, I mean like organized groups of patients, like cancer patients, AIDS, HIV patients. Like these are people where you have hundreds of thousands of people that will call their senator, that will like be really angry, that will insist that, they continue the funding. You don't have that for VRE. You don't have that for even C. diff. And we're trying to build that, but it's a much smaller disease. So I think the government, whether that's the US government or other governments, they need to take more of a hand and say, like, we need to look at like what is missing, like what do we not have any treatments for, and if the public needs to pay for that, then the public needs to pay for it, because the danger, I think if you look at something like the gains that we've made in oncology, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, cancers that in our lifetimes were virtually untreatable, were a death sentence. Now people live with them, people recover from them. And it's not really the same for infectious diseases. If you accept HIV, I think, HIV
Mm-hmm.
is the one where there's been a huge amount of development, but I don't think you have that if you don't have the community organizing and the relentless pressure of patient groups over the past 35 or 40 years.
And that makes a lot of sense. What about the individual perspective? What can the individual patient do to influence how the treatment that they receive and the treatment that is available?
So I think that's a two-part question. So I would say, for patients who want to advocate for themselves, we always offer, and this is something that I do myself, despite being, a professional patient advocate. So I think the first thing is we really need for people to get more sort of media literate, more discerning. You got people getting their health information from TikTok and Instagram. And, so we kind of had the return of snake oil salespeople where people are promising you, an unapproved drug or supplement or something and saying it's going to change your life and make you skinny and, cure your allergies or whatever. And so we have to get people to understand discernment. And then, if you do have an infection, if you need to go to the ER, anything like that, take somebody with you, spouse, family member, adult child. It can be difficult if you're sick. I go back to thinking about my mother. My mother was going into septic shock, and though she was conscious and speaking, sepsis affects your brain. So we had to take responsibility for her. We had to sign papers saying that we were her healthcare proxy because the cognitive effects of sepsis. Even without something like that severe, people are nervous, they're scared, they don't feel well. So having somebody with you who can, remember what you might not remember, it's a scary situation, take notes, maybe record things on their phone that the doctor is saying, all very important. And then if you're not in such an acute situation, we always say, prepare for your appointments, write down any issues with your condition, the treatment, and whatever has changed. And then, doctors are very busy. So I tell people, make sure they've answered all your questions. Be polite, but be firm. Don't be nasty, don't yell, but, be insistent that you get your questions answered or that you have the opportunity to share what's going on with you. So that's kind of your individual thing. I think the other part of it, which is maybe you had C. diff or you had a MRSA infection. My neighbor's business partner just got a mosquito bite golfing and it developed into a terrible MRSA infection. He was in the hospital for 6 days.
Whoa.
So I think we need more people to think about that thing that happened to them and think about how lucky they were and therefore be very interested in making sure that there are better treatments for MRSA and that there's better awareness of what MRSA looks like. I mean, even my own house, my husband had a blister on his foot from us running in the rain and we both work from home. We constantly together. And so for 4 days, he didn't say anything about it. And then we were supposed to go to an event and he was like, I don't think that he can go with my foot. And he took his sock off and it was terrifying.
Oh, no.
I was like, okay, we're going to the ER. You're getting that lanced. You need antibiotics. And he's the son of a doctor. And he lives with me. But I think people, I think particularly in the US context, I think Europeans are a little bit more chill about this. But people are like, oh, I got to go to work. Oh, I got to do the thing. Oh, this will be okay. Oh, it's going to cure itself. Care about yourself and then care about the people who may have the same infection that you had and maybe weren't so lucky.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. Also for basically everyone listening. Well,
be interested.
Yes, exactly. In yourself too. Yeah.
I mean, I'm often amazed. In the U.S., when we have political, we have elections or campaigns. They'll be talking about insurance and this and that. Never talk about public health.
Yeah.
They never talk about, well, how much more money are we going to invest in public health to just make sure that people don't get infections, to make sure that sanitation is clean, that kids don't live in areas where they're likely to get asthma because of Superfund sites or pollution. All of those things, if we want to talk about cutting costs or saving money for healthcare, preventing all of those things will make healthcare cheaper.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. It's somehow absent. It's more about how do we get more treatments, but not how do we prevent disease from happening in the first place.
Yeah. Well, there's not a lot of money in prevention, it turns out.
No, And then we're back to the system. How do we provide health? And should it be a profit game or should it be a public good?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think, if you invest a lot of money and, this as well as I do, that clinical trials can be enormously expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars for a vaccine development, sometimes $1 billion. So obviously, I run a nonprofit. We can't spend $1 billion if we can't raise $1 billion. And we're not even talking about anybody getting a profit. We're just talking about,
paying for costs,
paying for things. So, I think what can we do to make trials less expensive? Is there a way to do that? What I've noticed in trials, to be honest, is there's a lot of subvending. There's a lot of companies doing trial, they hire this vendor, that vendor hires a second vendor. And my feeling is throughout all of that, if they're for-profit companies, they're all trying to make a profit. So that money is actually not going as far as it could have if the company just kept their clinical trial thing in-house and just paid their staff. Do you know what I'm saying? Because they're not paying for the profits of another person or another group of investors.
Yeah.
And again, I don't mind some people making money, but,
well, in this space, there's a bit of a moral
exactly. We
obligation
need to
also.
We need to keep front of mind. And I think this is true of a lot of things in our country and in the world where it's I think one's ability to make a profit has to always be held side by side with the ethical and moral implications of that profit.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, as we start rounding off our conversation, I always ask the same question of my guests towards the end. And that is, if I gave you the transformation and trials magic wand, and this magic wand can change one thing in the life sciences industry, what would you wish to change?
This is probably not going to be shocking, but I would really like to make trials in particular, but also just healthcare in general, much more patient-focused. We spoke a little bit earlier about where are the areas that we lack effective treatments? How do we prioritize that? How do we pay for that development, right? How can we make trials more inclusive of diverse groups of people? It was within our lifetimes where most trials where basically drugs were tried on men, women weren't included, people of color weren't included, elderly people weren't included, disabled people weren't included, and yet, so we want to make sure that the drug is effective, right? But we also want to make sure that it's effective for everybody. And not just for a relatively healthy, somebody like me, a relatively healthy middle-aged white guy, right?
Yeah.
And then I think another thing that I think about is how do we keep the provider-patient relationship during a trial so patients don't just feel like a number, right? And then I think as sort of touching on what we last talked about, how do we motivate people to participate? How do we, the U.S. in particular, though I think Western culture more broadly is very individualistic. And we need people to start thinking about themselves as being in community. So if your loved one had C. diff and there's a C. diff vaccine trial and you meet the criteria, join the trial, And then I think, especially in the wake of COVID, I think something that everybody from regulatory agencies to local public health departments to industry, we need to think about how do we communicate accurately and effectively with patients. Most people do not have advanced degrees. Most people write and speak in about an 8th grade level, 8th grade in the US. So middle school, the end of middle school. And so, and I grew up very working class. I was the first person in my family to get a college degree. So how do we talk to those people in a way that is sympathetic, empathetic, isn't patronizing, isn't talking down to them, and motivate them to want to be involved, not just for them as a patient, but for their larger community. And I think that is something that maybe decentralized trials, maybe sort of meeting people where they are, something that I really appreciate that happened in New York, thanks to some of our Congress people, when the COVID vaccines were first available, is that they brought trucks to poor
the communities. That's great.
Communities that are underserved and also are not native English speakers. And I think that actually enormously helped the uptake of the vaccine. And again, maybe I think we need to think beyond ourselves because the people in those communities are also the people who work in hotels, they work in restaurants, they clean up after white collar professionals. Vaccinating those people is going to protect us and protect them. Yeah. So, so even if you need to have a little bit of a selfishness in your interest, you have an interest in those people being vaccinated or being treated for their communicable disease and not giving it to you,
Now, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Where can my listeners find more information about your foundation?
Well, you can go to cdiff.org, so cdiff.org. That is the website for the Peggy Lillis Foundation. You can also follow us on most social media. We're on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, all at Peggy Fund, because Peggy Lillis Foundation is too long. You just look us up. I mean, Peggy, my last name, which of course is my mother's last name, is very uncommon. So if you Google Peggy Lillis, you'll find us.
Awesome. Well, it was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Same. Thank you for having me, Lana.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. This is your host, Ivana Rosendal. I have been creating this podcast since 2021. For me, it is important that we have this sort of conversations in our industry and find common ways to transform. If you want to support this podcast, you can now do so by going to buymeacoffee.com/transformation in trials and donating. Each episode costs about $99 or €85 to produce. Also, if you are interested in becoming a guest on the show, then find a link in the show notes for how to fill out a form and pitch yourself. Thank you for now. See you next time.